Oh,
Everybody, this is Elaine Tylori, the director of the library.
I just wanted to welcome everyone to this wonderful session, to thank Dr. Shanker for again offering a wonderful session. And we're just delighted to be able to host all of you. So enjoy. I know we have a wonderful set of programs ahead of us.
Thank you.
Okay, so Mark, we get started in a minute. I'm still letting people in, and I'll do that as they come. It shouldn't disturb anything. So why don't I just start with my little introduction, and we'll take it from there.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wilton Library. And a special welcome to our wait-listed guests who, for the first time, are watching this through a YouTube live stream that you're trying for the first time. So welcome, YouTube live streamers. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. Before we begin, first a few notes. Your microphones and cameras should be off, and it is important that you keep them off during the program. Also, because we have a very large audience, we'll handle the brief Q&A at the end in the following way. You can send me questions in the chat window. They'll come directly to me, and I will ask Mark one or two of them at the end. But because we have such a lot of material to cover, it's a huge epic in only 4 hours, we really want to make the most of Mark's presence with us. So the Q&A at the end will be just very short, maybe 5 minutes or so. But I want to mention that Mark is always happy to answer questions by direct email. And when I send the link for the recording tomorrow, probably tomorrow in the morning or during the day, I'll include his email address in that. So if you do have a question and we don't have time to address it today, just send him an email. He's very happy to respond to them. Our speaker, Mark Shanker, has been at Yale College since 1990, and he's currently Senior Associate Dean of the college and Dean of Academic Affairs. A former lecturer in the English department at Yale, he received his PhD from Columbia University with a concentration in 19th century and early 20th century English literature. For over 30 years, Dean Shanker has lectured on literature and film and has led book discussion groups in more than 100 venues in Connecticut, including public libraries, retirement communities, museums, and cultural centers. Last October, he gave us a great 3-part series on reading James Joyce, and that's where the idea for this series on Homer's Odyssey originated. And just a couple of weeks ago, gave us a wonderful lecture on the topic of literature and life. I'm sure many of you were there. We're thrilled to have him back for the next 4 weeks, so please join me in welcoming Mark Shanker.
Thanks very much, Michael. Let me repeat that I am delighted to answer any questions you send by email. I'm jealous of my own time for your sake to make as much of the 57 minutes or whatever we have left to talk to you about the Odyssey. I got into teaching literature not to lecture at people, but to have conversations with them. And when I do my usual library talks or private book groups, there's a lot of discussion. And I regret that given this format, we can't do that, but I will try to give you as much of my conversational style as possible. I am very interested in giving you a sense of the Odyssey as a work of art, as a poem, something that is not ossified or fossilized, something that is living and breathing and is meant to be a celebration of civilization by the Greeks in the face of savagery, of adventure and loss. So there's nothing magical about my dividing it into 4 sections. There's nothing about the first 6 books that hang together any differently from the next 6. It's just that we're dividing by 4. The poem has 24 books because the ancient Greek alphabet had 24 letters. It's meant to be encyclopedic. When Joyce wrote his Ulysses, he gave it 18 chapters because he knew why the Odyssey had 24. And he also knew Gaelic, which he couldn't read. had 18 letters in the alphabet. That's why Ulysses has 18 chapters. So the Odyssey is an epic poem of over 12,000 lines of dactylic hexameter verse. That is, each line has 6 units or feet, therefore hexameter, and each foot, each unit, is composed of a long syllable followed by 2 short syllables. That is, like the finger, a long joint and 2 smaller joints. Dactyl means finger in Greek. They were not stressed the way English poetry talks about stress and unstressed syllables. They were either elongated or shortened. So whose woods these are, I think I know, might be read as whose woods these are, I think I know. It would absolutely be musical. It would be sung, often from memory, accompanied by music, often over many days of a festival or a family celebration in the context of a wealthy person's home, or possibly something like a community center. So arts and community and civilization would be the context of the recapitulation of the poem. It would be celebrated in that context. So there are variations in the verse form, and a lot of the variation is caused by lines running over into the next line to make a long musical flow. There's nothing sing-song about it in the sense of being a doggerel. So as I said, first and foremost, it's a poem, and I'd like you to keep that in mind. The stress in the poem is everywhere on the value of art, of civilization, of community, of domesticity, epic itself, the singing, the celebration, hospitality, and the role of both the host and the guest in being civil to one another. Throughout the poem, the spectacular and supernatural adventures of Odysseus, what many middle schoolers and high schoolers and people well beyond those years remember best, are counterbalanced by the values of native land, of home, family, and domesticity, eating, sleeping in bed with your family. If the Iliad is a poem of war, the Odyssey is a poem of peace. And if you've read the first 6 books for tonight, you've not only come across many instances of conviviality and hospitality and feeding strangers, but you've seen that sometimes exactly the same language is used, not because the poet lacks imagination, although it does help for memorization, but because the point is it's so ritualistic, it's repeated in the same way that you might repeat the words of an anthem or a prayer. So one thing I'd like you to keep in mind for the entire series, and will help you in any study of ancient Greek literature, is that the entire enterprise of ancient Greek literature, the poems, the plays, the myths, the epics, is to locate human beings on the middle band of existence, below the gods and above the beasts and monsters. And let me say at this point, monster originally came from a word meaning to warn, like remonstrance. Monster meant to show or warn. And it began as a reference to deformed animals on farms where a pig might be born with 2 heads. And it was thought by the Greeks that this was a sign of something wicked. There was something evil, possibly in the farmer or the land, not in the animal itself. And so monster in its original usage only referred to animals who were freaks, really, and something went wrong with nature. And then it got extended to human beings who seem monstrous. The Greeks, ancient Greeks, were very interested in trying to locate human beings in their mortality between the gods, who, although they're immortal, and have superpowers, are like human beings with foibles and vices and sometimes silliness. And above the creatures, the beasts, the monsters, that are never something radically new. They're always a kind of amalgam of creatures that already exist. That is, deformed creatures, animals, beings. The Minotaur is half man, half bull. Medusa is a woman with snakes for her hair. The Hydra is a serpent with many heads. Cerberus is a dog with 3 heads and the mane of snakes and the claws of a lion. The Sphinx that figures so prominently in Oedipus Rex has the face of a woman, the body of a lion, and wings of some kind of bird or dragon. The point that I'm making is not that the Greeks lacked an imagination. Why couldn't they have made a god that didn't look like a human being and had extraordinary powers all the same? Why couldn't they think of a monster that was not just a collection of things that are already around? It's because the human element and the human context of the animals and creatures they see is so prominent that it's invested in everything. The Greeks knew that human beings were capable of divine acts of courage and forgiveness and mercy, just as they knew they were capable of horrific, monstrous, unnatural acts of incest and murder and cruelty of killing the children of their enemies and serving those children for dinner. That kind of garishness, human beings are capable of that kind of cruelty. And what the Greeks are trying to do is suggest that human beings are capable of divinity and that kind of cruelty, and suggest a way that in their courage and kindness and forgiveness, they might be godlike. And in adhering to patterns of ritual and reverence, they may stop themselves from becoming savage. Civilization is always at risk. This poem is set the 13th century BC, the Bronze Age. Civilization is very vulnerable to weather, to disease, think of us now today, to invaders. The Greeks lived in an area of the world where there were constant tradespeople and people passing through, especially in the Peloponnese, the southern part of Greece, that's lots of islands and isthmuses. They were very aware that what they had was very fragile. And the best way to think of the Odyssey is it's a poem in honor of keeping civilization in spite of all the threats against it. So keep in mind that notion of trying to locate civilization, human civilization, between extremes. And that's why they spend so much time with Olympus and with creatures like Scylla and Charybdis, the sirens, or the Cyclops. So it's my hope that you've read the handout that was posted by Michael, so that you can have the introduction that I gave in that handout, so I don't have to repeat it this evening. You will be helped in terms of being prepared for my lecture if you can review, either actually read the 6 books under discussion or consideration, or at least read a summary of them. And you'll be especially helped by reading the handout. So what I'll say tonight is, whereas the central awareness in the Iliad is of human mortality, they are fighting, many people die, they're trying to kill others, and the need for warriors to win undying glory, fame everlasting. Kleos aphthathon is the Greek word. The ancient Greeks did not believe in a heaven in the conventional sense that Judeo-Christian theology holds. They believed that you were kept alive in the memory of other people, and you became immortalized in song and legend. While that's the central awareness in the Iliad, the essential enterprise in the Odyssey is survival in this world. The return home, the Greek word for that is nostos, N-O-S-T-O-S. It's related to ours, O-U-R-S. And that nostos, that return home, is only made possible by the hero's mental toughness and persistence, not just physical, and by the fidelity of the people who are waiting for him. Nostos is where we get our word nostalgia, the love of the past, the love of home. And in fact, there is an art form, a literary form in ancient Greek literature, the celebration of home. And that kind of poem is called a nostoi, wanting to go back home. Zeus, in the first book, like the wandering warrior king, stresses the value and power of memory, of conscientious fidelity, by replying to Athena, how on earth could I forget Odysseus? But when she argues that he hasn't been attentive because Athena, who had set her will against Odysseus and his crew at the beginning of their return home, because one of his crew members, well, one of the Greeks destroyed a shrine to Athena, she's changed her mind along the way, and she's hoping that Zeus will remember. When he says, how on earth could I forget? That's my Robert Fagel's translation, which is often colloquial to try to make the poem modern. It would have sounded modern to the ears of the 8th century, 500 years after it's set, composed in the 8th century, the 8th century listeners, but it emphasizes the notion of the importance of forgetting and remembering, even to the gods. By contrast to his saying he could never forget, many characters in the epic forget or are inattentive. In book 2, Mentor upbraids the men of Ithaca. Think, not one of all the people whom he ruled remembers Odysseus now, that godlike man, and kindly as a father to his children. He's been gone so long, 20 years, 10 in Troy, 10 on the way back. 20 is one of those numbers in ancient Greece that is used for a kind of smallish big number. When Telemachus sets out to get news of his father in these first 4 books, he takes 20 men with him. When Calypso allows Odysseus to build a raft, he uses 20 pieces of wood. In later books, we will encounter forgetfulness in the famous episodes of the Lotus Eaters in book 9, whose drug addiction makes them forget everything, including going home, and of Circe, who drugs the mariners to wipe from their memories any thought of home. So forgetting and remembering are crucial issues throughout the poem. We see the fatal consequences of inattentiveness in the death of the youngest of Odysseus's companions, Elpenor, who, quote, forgot to climb back again by the long ladder, and consequently fell asleep. Headlong from the roof he plunged, his neck snapped from the backbone, and his soul flew down to death. We'll see that in book 10. The point there is that this man who survived all kinds of dangers was inattentive and fell because when he woke up, he forgot he was sleeping on a roof. In our reading of the Odyssey, we must be attentive always to mindfulness. We have to pay attention to paying attention. That's a very important theme. Another theme to watch for is that of hospitality. The Greek word would be xenia, Xenia. It is related to the xenos of foreigner that gives us xenophobia. It would be wrong, absolutely wrong, to think of xenia as being related to fear of outsiders, fear of foreigners. What our word xenophobia means, swallowed up by phobia. The way to think about xenia is it means really hospitality. The best way to think of it, it's the way of immediately converting a stranger to a friend. In fact, in several places in the epic, someone is greeted as stranger dash friend, or stranger long hyphen friend, which is to say the kind of friend you make of a stranger. It's very important to see that it's not an opposition, but a hybrid, as distinguished from philos, the kind of friend you love because they're in your family or long acquaintance. It's a kind of guest, stranger friend all at once. So the hospitality ritual for the Greeks involved social norms that bound hosts to guests. And again, think of how many people would be passing through the Greek islands in an average year. The geography of the islands and its city-states meant that they were constantly meeting, hosting, and seafaring strangers. So in the context of hospitality, xenos, Xenos, might be construed as guest friend, And it's in this sense that Telemachus employs to Athena, who is disguised as the mortal Mentes, in the first words spoken by a mortal in the Odyssey. The very first words spoken by a human being are, "Greetings, stranger. Here in our house, you will find a royal welcome. Have supper first, then tell us what you need. Eat first, and then tell us what we can do for you." That's the hallmark of the entire work. It shows you that Telemachus is worthy of his father and that he's a prince worthy of being a king. Although his heart is obsessed with grief, we're told, and he had been sitting among the suitors who have overrun his mother's house and are therefore extreme violators of the code of Xenia. They are rude guests, and rude is not a minor, trivial thing. It's a sin against reverence. It's a sin against community. Even though his heart is obsessed with grief over the absence of his father and the fact that the suitors, that's a polite term for them, have overrun his mother's home, he hurries to welcome his visitor with, we're told, winged words, because he's mortified that a guest might still be standing at the doors. Hospitable behavior and the lack of it are important registers of civilized behavior in this epic of homecoming. And I want to say again, if you understand the power of home, a home or native land is referred to 24 times or more in the first book alone of the Odyssey. So the first 4 books concern Telemachus going out and coming back to search for news about his father and to give the bardic poet a chance to remind his audience of what happened at Troy. So he goes to Pylos and sees Mentor, and he learns of the Trojan War, including about the Trojan horse. A good trivia question is, where in the Iliad do you learn the story of the Trojan horse? And the answer is nowhere. You have to read the Odyssey to learn about the Trojan horse in Homer, because the Iliad is not ultimately concerned with taking Troy. It's ultimately concerned with the respect for one's enemy. And so it doesn't end with the fall of Troy. It ends with the funeral services for their enemy, Hector, who is hailed as a breaker of horses. That is a rancher, a man of domesticity. So he goes to Pylos, talks to Mentor, and he learns about Agamemnon. He learns about how Agamemnon returned from Troy alive, but was murdered by his wife and her lover, later to be avenged by his son Orestes, which becomes a part of a long cycle of tragic plays. That's not only to remind the listeners of what happened at Troy and to Agamemnon, it's to provide in the tragic story of the murdered Agamemnon a counterbalance to the comic story of Odysseus, who is actually going to make it home, as everybody listening knew. If you just think I gave you a spoiler and you've now learned that Odysseus gets home, I'm sorry, but the poem's been around a long time. Presumably you've been around a long time. Everybody in Homer's day would know that Odysseus gets back. They're not listening for plot. They're listening for style, for civilization, for situations, for texture. And the 4th book has Telemachus go to Sparta, Menelaus and Helen, who tell other stories. The Trojan horse is in that 4th book, other stories about the war, and name some of the great Trojan heroes. We learn also in book 4 that the goddess is going to protect Telemachus from the plot of the suitors to kill him. So the first 4 books, which are called the Telemachy, are partly stalling. It's to put off getting to Odysseus, who first appears in book 5. But it's also to emphasize that Odysseus is actually missing, that in his own poem, he doesn't show up until the 5th book. He is covered. The word Calypso, of the woman who has kept him captive, means to cover or to hide, to cover over, as with leaves. He's hidden, And it also gives a chance for Telemachus to be a kind of double of his father by going out. And here he successfully comes back, and through the intervention of the goddess Athena, wisdom, he will not be killed. And so it looks good for Odysseus when he shows up, which is in book 5. So in book 5, when we see Odysseus for the first time, it begins with a second council of the gods. So the first book begins with a council of the gods, where Athena implores Zeus to do the right thing, and Hermes is going to be sent as a messenger, and things get set in motion. And at that first council, where it's proposed that Hermes be sent by Zeus to Ogygia to tell Calypso she has to release Odysseus, while she, Athena, is going to journey to Ithaca to assist Telemachus, that is the things we've just seen. The question is, since the result of this second council, the council that takes up much of book 5, is merely that Zeus acts on Athena's proposal from the first council, we might want to wonder why there has to be a second council at all. Why do we need a council to say those things that we decided to do, we did them? Why doesn't he just begin the fifth book by saying a meanwhile scenario? Even as Athena was aiding Telemachus, swift-footed Hermes was on his way across the seas to do this next thing, that is to do the freeing of Odysseus. The answer is an important one because it gives insight into the construction of the poem. Homer's narrative style is what it's called paratactic. P-A-R-A-T-A-X-I-S, parataxis, not surprisingly a Greek word. Parataxis means putting side by side. And it's the placing of clauses or narrative segments one after the other without joining them by coordinating or subordinating connectives. This is what Hemingway does so often. Hemingway doesn't write short sentences. He writes long sentences, but he says this and then this and then this and this. He doesn't use markers to say simultaneously this happened while that happened. So his method, which is certainly a consequence of oral composition, is to narrate events sequentially. That's why there's so much emphasis on successive dawns in the Odyssey. The sun rises 32 times in the poem. Now, there are many more dawns in the time that Odysseus is away, but 32 times the dawn is referenced to mark the passage of time. Typically, there is no simultaneity, no meanwhile back of a palace markers in Homer's narration. There are a few exceptions, and very little subordination of segments connected by, for example, after, because, before, since. The listeners knew what happened. It's just a matter of narrating them in the right order. It's the same reason why in a play like Oedipus Rex or Medea, there's only one set, there's only one plot, there's only one time frame. If something happened 3 years ago in Oedipus or Medea, there's no flashback. The Greeks had no conception of that. Somebody has to come as a messenger and tell the audience and the person on stage what happened those years ago. They had no sense of the decorum that you could actually break the time. If you're in the theater watching Oedipus for 52 minutes of his life have passed by in that time. So the Odyssey begins with the first council with the gods, followed by Athena's journey to Telemachus, and then a second council followed by Hermes' mission to Calypso's island, even though both those things were covered in the first council. The emphasis on the first council is on the Agamemnon story, with its issue of the deserved punishment of transgressing mortals. The line is, "Let them all die so, all who do such things." This is apt, given the chapters that follow, in which Telemachus is called upon to act the part of Orestes, that is, the avenging son, and the suitors are cast in the sacrilegious role of the lover, Clytemnestra's lover. As we've noted, Odysseus is completely absent from that entire section, books 1 through 4. In the second council, the emphasis is not on punishment, but on the return of the wanderer. Odysseus journeys home, the exile must return. And let me say a word here about exile. The Greeks' love of their native land, which is not to be thought of as Greece, there was no nation of Greece, but rather as their city-state, sometimes even a kind of province within that area, their people, and the devotion was a very big part of their self-definition. That's why the punishment worse than death in many of the works of literature is exile. Oedipus is not put to death, he's exiled as if he's anathema and not fit to live with other people or to return home. To the Greek mind, it's a very, very savage punishment. So the exile must return. But associated in the second section of the poem that begins with book 5 and covers book 5 and 6 that we're discussing tonight, is the contrast between immortal gods and mortal men. Book 5 opens with a reference of the marriage of the goddess of the dawn and the mortal Tithonus. And in the same book, Calypso angrily states that Zeus wants her to give up Odysseus because the gods are scandalized when goddesses sleep with mortals. There is a separation between those two classes of beings that the poem is arguing in favor of, the separation. Human beings should not overreach. And listeners of the poem would know well the story of Tithonus, sometimes called Tithon, Tithon, a very famous and powerful poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. He was a mortal who fell in love with the goddess of the dawn and wants to marry her, let's be polite, wants to marry her, and is told that that's not a good idea. Even the goddess of the dawn, Io, says, I know you want me to ask Zeus to make you immortal, but it's really not a good idea. Mortals shouldn't do this thing. He's so passionate, he supplicates, she gives in. Zeus grants it, knowing full well what the problem is. Nobody read the small print. And so Zeus allows Tithon to live forever, but he forgot to ask to say young. And so he ages, and he ages forever. And because he's in love with the goddess of the dawn, every time she shows up for their assignations, he's a day older. And he becomes impossibly old and asks to be relieved of his gift, and is told that even the gods themselves cannot take back their gifts. And he becomes the only person in the universe of gods and mortals who is immortal, but dying forever. And that's the kind of imagination of the Greeks, where they're saying basically, watch out, because this is dangerous stuff, this desiring to be godlike. It's like the King Midas, who wants everything he touches to turn to gold and forgets that it means it's impossible for him then to touch food or to embrace his daughter. So Calypso reveals in book 5 to Hermes that she had offered to make Odysseus a god if he would stay with her. And everybody hearing that offer in the audience would have the previous reference just then to Tithonus in their minds. I welcomed him warmly, cherished him, even vowed to make the man immortal, ageless all his days. And people would have recognized that's not a good fix. It also doesn't let the exile come home. Later, when Calypso questions Odysseus about why he is choosing to return to his wife rather than stay with her, she resents that she has to compete with a mortal. I might claim to be nothing less than she, neither in face nor figure. Hardly right is it, she says, for mortal woman to rival immortal goddess. This section of the poem is replete, that is book 5, with references to the mortal-immortal contrast, usually centering on a female. We notice the goddess who saves Odysseus with her scarf was previously a mortal woman named Ino. We should also note that Odysseus, who is aided by Athena, and courted by Calypso and offered immortality, chooses mortal life, even though it will continue to be a life of pain. And in the card that Michael put up at the beginning, there's a representation of the hero Odysseus in agony. His name actually means man of pain, man of many sufferings. So he says to Calypso, book 5, all you say is true, how well I know. Look at my wise Penelope. She falls far short of you, your beauty, stature. She is mortal after all, and you never age or die. Nevertheless, I long, I pine all my days to travel home and see the dawn of my return. And if a god will not wreck me yet again on the wine-dark sea, I can bear that too, with a spirit tempered to endure. Much have I suffered, labored long and hard by now in the waves and wars. Add this to the total, that is this last part of his journey, bring the trial on. To the Greek mind, this is not defiance, but rather a courageous and reverent acceptance of life, even if it's a life of extraordinary travail. We remember the myth of Sisyphus, who knows that every time he raises the boulder, it will drop down again, but feels there's dignity in accepting the futility of his fate. When, after his wrath is wreaked by Poseidon in book 5, and we learn that Poseidon has it in for Odysseus and his crew because the men have eaten the cattle of the sun god, who is Poseidon's son. Lots of relations in the Odyssey. Homer signifies the humanity of his hero by having him kiss the good green earth, and stand before us naked, speechless, breathless, bone-weary, a man of misery, we're told. That's what his name means. In Odysseus' own words, but a man. At the end of book 5, he covers himself up in leaves. And again, kolypian is the Greek verb for conceal. It's etymologically related to Calypso, whose name can mean both the hidden one and one who hides. And Calypso has hidden Odysseus for a long time on her island. Odysseus has been hidden from us in the first 4 books of the poem. And when he makes it to land and he's about to reveal himself to Nausicaa, he covers himself yet again, and it's described as an epic simile. And I want to read this to you because one of the most significant things about the style of the Odyssey, it's true also of the Iliad, is how epic similes are made. And that is, instead of saying, my love is like a red, red rose, and the simile is an explicit comparison using the word like, and you'll remember that a metaphor does not use a comparison word. I'm not speaking down to you. These fundamentals are more helpful than we thought when we learned them in middle school. A metaphor is hidden. Don't cry over spilt milk confuses the child who doesn't know that it's not about milk. But if I say my love is like a red, red rose, even if I don't know the word rose, I know that a comparison is being made. So in the example that I've given to many of my book group participants, if I say he eats like a pig, even if you don't know what a pig is, you know that I've made a comparison. It is more elemental, it's more obvious. Similes abound in ancient works, biblical works, and also in Homeric epics, because it's not just more primitive. The poet wants to show you what he is doing. He doesn't want you to miss the power of the poetry. If by contrast, I don't say he eats like a pig, if I say instead, he is a pig, and you don't know what a pig is, you have no idea that I've made a comparison. Maybe he actually is a pig. It's my pig, Bruno. Maybe he's a pig, one of the Philadelphia pigs, very nice people. I went to high school with their son. Maybe he's a pig because my neighborhood couldn't afford the Brotherhood of Elks, and he's a pig, a fraternal organization. You have no way of knowing what it means. And so Homer does not prefer metaphors because he doesn't want the connection to be lost, and he doesn't want you to miss what he's doing. He's calling attention to his powers as a poet. And so when Odysseus first reveals himself, having gotten rid of the clothes he got from Calypso right after he's described as a man of misery. And this is book 6, around line 140. What an epic simile does is, instead of saying my love is like a red, red rose, it foregrounds the rose, that is the thing that's being brought into the poem. It talks about it at great length, and then it says, that's what my love is like. So here's the example. And out he stalked, this is him coming out of hiding, naked. Out he stalked as a mountain lion, exultant in his power, strides through wind and rain, and his eyes blaze, and he charges sheep or oxen or chases wild deer, but his hunger drives him on to go for flocks, even to raid the best defended homestead. So Odysseus moved out, about to mingle with all those lovely girls, naked now as he was. I want to pause over this because you will encounter many, many epic similes in the rest of this poem, and also in the Iliad. I want you to appreciate the power. He sometimes talks so long about the thing that he's importing into the poem. So there's no lion in this poem. It's Odysseus, that you get breathless, maybe impatient, but breathless at the splendor of the depiction of the lion. And then you're reminded as an afterthought, so Odysseus walked out. I'll give you another example at about end of book 5, when he decides in his weariness to go to sleep and wait the next day he's going to wind up meeting Nausicaa. So book 5, and again, it's around lines 530, ends this way. A fine litter of dead leaves had drifted in, enough to cover 2 men over, even 3, in the wildest kind of winter known to man. Long enduring, great Odysseus, overjoyed at the sight, bedded down in the midst and heaped the leaves around him, as a man will bury his glowing brand in black ashes off on a lonely farmstead, no neighbor near to keep a spark alive, no need to kindle fire from somewhere else. The precious notion of a curfew covering over the fire so it never goes completely out because you don't want to have to rekindle in the morning. So great Odysseus buried himself in leaves, and Athena showered sleep upon his eyes, sleep in a swift wave, delivering him from all his pains and labors, blessed sleep that sealed his eyes at last. That's the epic simile. First, the thing that's being brought in by the poet that's not in the poem. So there's no fire in this poem. But it associates the hidden Odysseus with a spark that's going to burst into flame again. Just as in the earlier example I gave from book 6, it associates Odysseus with a powerful and maybe rapacious lion that's going to go among these virgin girls. So the other thing that I want to point out of episodes, not of events, but of language, is how often what's being emphasized is the scenes of domesticity. So when in book 3, he's visiting with Nestor, after they drink and eat, this is what's described on book 3 around line 440. Once they had poured their offerings, drunk their fill, the Pylians went to rest, each in his own house. But the noble chariot driver, that's Nestor, let Telemachus, King Odysseus' son, sleep at the palace now on a corded bed inside the echoing colonnade, with Prince Paratactic close beside him there, the young spearman, already captain of armies, though the last son still unwed within the halls. The king retired to chambers deep in his lofty house, where the queen, his wife, arranged and shared their bed. That's not just filler. That's not just giving you weather or local color. That's what civilization is. People offering beds to strangers, and men and women who are married sharing a bed. If you haven't read the poem, you're not familiar with how it turns out. I won't ruin for you that the bed that Odysseus shares with his wife, Penelope, becomes an important part of his identification. That kind of domestic scene is repeated throughout the book, and sometimes in the exact same language. So when Menelaus welcomes Telemachus and greets him and the people with him as strangers, comma, guests, what I mentioned before, guests because you're strangers. There's no opposition there. They're intimately connected. I can befriend you precisely because you're a stranger. When he welcomes them in, we're told, once they feasted their eyes with gazing at it all, into the burnished tubs they climbed and bathed. When women had washed them, that is Telemachus and his crew, rubbed them all down with oil and drawn warm fleece and shirts around their shoulders, they took up seats of honor next to Atrides Menelaus. A maid brought water soon in a graceful golden pitcher, and over a silver basin tipped it out so they might rinse their hands, then pulled a gleaming table to their side. A staid housekeeper, that is to say, a woman who knows how to be a housekeeper, who is prim. Prim might be a better word in translation, attentive to her appearance, brought on bread to serve them. Appetizers aplenty too, lavish with her bounty. As a carver lifted platters of meat toward them, meats of every sort, and set before them golden cups, the red-haired king Menelaus greeted both guests warmly. Well, it turns out that exact description, word for word, has been used some, in my volume, 40 pages earlier in the previous book. As I said, it becomes a formula where nobody would have said, I can't believe you're using that same language again. It rises to the level of ritual, and ritual is partly defined by knowing the right words. Our word for spell, in the sense of a magic spell, is etymologically related to spelling a word, to carry the notion that if you don't get the words right, you can't do the magic. If you don't get open sesame right, the spell, the language won't work. And so there is always in the poem a deep connection, attention to language, and the language of hospitality as a reverential connection to other human beings, as a way also to honor the gods, and a great attention to the repetition of language, patterns of repetition in the poem. Again, it makes it easier for the bard who's singing this poem to remember it, but no one's going to say as they listen, I wish they'd make something different of that gleaming table or the appetizers aplenty. Bounty is one of the things that's being celebrated. So as a review, now that we're at 50 minutes, this idea of the tension in the poem between savagery, monstrosity, cruelty, the adventurous, supernatural danger, and the desire to get home, native land, household, family, that is the heart of the poem. To consider the poem as a poem in its language, as a work of art, and that art itself is part of civilization. Again, the actual act of hearing the poem in a communal setting recapitulates the whole idea in the same way that religious services recapitulate the Last Supper or the events of Passover by doing them again in a community setting, whether it's a church or a temple or at a Seder. The idea is that you not only remember the past, you redo it, you recreate it. That's very big in ancient Greek culture. It becomes a ritual. Our word companion comes from the people we break bread. The pan in companion is the bread that we share with people. That's very powerful in ancient Greek myth. And the attention to epic similes as a way of the poet, the anonymous poet, probably a collection of poets, and a collection in a informal way, not an organization, wasn't a think tank of poets working on this, but a way of the artist to make clear that they have a hand in making of the poem. Similes are not just more primitive, they're more powerful. You can't miss them. And they have exactly the same relationship to a metaphor, which can be invisible, that a reference or footnote has to an allusion. An allusion makes a reference without telling you it makes a reference. If you don't know that something rotten in the state of Denmark comes from Hamlet, they're not going to tell you. But a reference makes it clear that Hamlet is being invoked and who he is. The Greek poet does not want you to miss the power of the connection of a sleeping Odysseus to a fire being carefully covered up with leaves to keep the spark alive. In this case, the spark is his desire to go home, or that in his powerful nakedness, he might seem like a rapacious lion, even though we know his intentions are quite different. So I'll end there because that seemed like a natural break. In book 6, Nausicaa promises to take Odysseus to her father, and there the father is going to greet the stranger as a friend guest, and we will see what happens in book 7 and beyond next week. Michael, I'll turn it over to you if you have a question or two you'd like me to turn my attention to.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot, Mark. And that was pretty intense, very dense, but very, very interesting. A different way, I think, of looking at the poem. Very enjoyable, a lot to chew on. I'm sure there will be many people who have just seen this who will watch the recording in the next few days to review certain things.
Let me just interject, Michael, that when you say intense and dense, I didn't write the poem. I'm only trying to say some nice things about it.
Well, you made some really interesting points that I hadn't thought of myself. So a lot to think about. So I have one question. It's something fairly specific about the structure of the poem. How is the meter, so with the dactyls and spondees, used to enhance Homer's narrative style, as perhaps used with the similes?
Yeah. So the best way I can explain it, not being a reader of ancient Greek, is if you remember that we do metrics by stresses and non-stressors. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, iambic pentameter, every second syllable gets a beat. That's one of Shakespeare's sonnets. That time of year thou mayst in me behold. And the beats tell you how to read the line. Well, if the entire sonnet were written in iambic pentameter that way, it would sound like doggerel. But conversational stressors and changes in the meter and run-ons from one sentence to another, one line to another, hide the rhymes. The same thing's true in the Odyssey, and especially if you have a 12,000 line poem. If you hear passages, you will hear that the rhythm of the music, long, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short, that is the syllables stretched out, will have a pattern that seems repetitious, but they'll be broken up by varying patterns. They will run over to the next line. You will be distracted from the music by the lyric, in the same way that we know, if we're paying attention, that this song has a certain polka waltz, a polka rhythm to it, but we don't notice it if the lyrics take our attention away from the pattern. And the epic similes create these little insets or vignettes in the same way that when I say don't cry over spilt milk, I've introduced milk into a milk-free environment. That's what metaphors and similes do. He's introducing the idea of a farmer all alone at night, keeping the spark of his fire alive till morning, or a lion coming down looking for prey as a way of breaking up the rhythm of the music of the story. It's a little bit like old Westerns where you get the Western, but then you have an episode in a saloon with a performance or dancing girls, not always for the best reason, but it's a kind of breaking up of what would otherwise be a constant horse riding, gun shooting kind of enterprise. I myself don't read ancient Greek, so I don't want to pretend to have more knowledge of this than I do. And I come at this tonight and for the next 3 nights as someone who absolutely admires this poem as what I think it is, a great hymn to civilization in the face of things that could destroy it. You have another, Michael?
No, actually, that was that's the question that we have, and that was a great answer. And I think your concluding comment is a fantastic place to end this particular evening. Couple of minutes to 6, and that's where we wanted to close it. I want to remind everybody that Mark is completely happy to respond to emails, and I'll put his email address on the email that I send tomorrow with the link to the recording and with the short handout for next week. And so we look forward to seeing you all next Thursday, and we'll pick it up, Mark.
Michael, I want to thank you for making this possible and the people on your end who help. And I want to thank my silent and invisible listeners. I know you're out there, and say that I'm very grateful that you took time out of your day to come listen, and I hope you'll come back. Thank you all, and thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. See you all next week, everybody.